Good morning. Welcome, everybody, and visitors as well. So, I'm going to read I'll read one verse. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time that we're able to gather and continue in our plodding through the history of the medieval church. We pray that you would help us and draw even great application to our Christian life for Jesus' sake. Amen. All right, so next month, which is coming up soon, is graduation month for many colleges and some high schools. And what you'll notice when you go to graduation is that there is something very medieval about the whole experience. So you will see people, men and women, wearing black robes, looking a little Harry Potter-esque. You'll see pointed hoods, which is the precursor to what we think of with the witch's hood for Halloween, the big pointy black hat. You'll see various colored garments around the robes and tassels and funny medieval hats that are called tams. And these ceremonies and the rituals that go into even American education and graduation ceremonies and these sorts of things are all connected in the West to our medieval past and to our Christian heritage. The idea of the university and the idea of education being something that is taught within a specific nucleus is something that is distinctively Christian, and it's something that is connected to church history. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? There's only so many weeks that we can do this. Why focus on this today? There's really important application that I'll give at the end. So let's look at a bit of an educational timeline. We know that in antiquity, and if you think back, we've talked about literacy in this class, and medieval literacy compared to ancient literacy. And in antiquity, the elite of society, remember those that were the sort of top tier people, were educated in philosophy and math and rhetoric, and that was part of antiquity. And as Christianity spread throughout Europe, Christianity, and this still happens today, learning came with it. So reading and the ability to possess and process ideas is something essential to the Christian faith, because we come with an idea, and that idea needs to be intellectually processed, and our God has given us a book, and so we need to read so that we're able to hear from our God. This was not only true of elite men, it was true of women and children as well. As the Christian faith spread, women were able to read and encouraged to read, and children were taught in reading as well. And people that historically were not readers or were not educated were beginning to be educated. So you think about shepherds and farmers and those that tended crops, things that historically wouldn't need to be able to read. Christianity said you too should be able to read. You too need to have an education so that you can grow in your knowledge of God. Now, eventually, monastic schools were set up, monks that gathered, and those that went, they were taught of these monks, and that sort of became the way that the system was set up as monks were those that were helping to preserve society. I mentioned several months ago a book that I would encourage you to read if you're into this thing, this sort of thing. It's a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, a really neat book about as the world is burning and falling apart around us, that these Irish monasteries were really this nucleus that is holding together Western civilization. So that happened in monastic schools, and then difficult times came, and there was persecution. We talked about the Vikings. We threw Paul under the bus because he's our Viking ancestor represented in the room. And we talked about the Vikings and how they spread throughout Europe, and they tore down cathedrals, and they sliced up monks and did all sorts of destructive things. And then as that time died down and Vikings were converted to Christianity, there was a monastic renewal. And in that monastic renewal, we saw again education rise. So there's this huge dip in literacy that you're able to follow within the timeline. And then after those invasions, literacy and education begins to rise again as monasteries become the center of learning and the preservation of knowledge. And then eventually, there is something of a difference in the way the monasteries are teaching and the great cathedrals, the great centers of the cities, the city churches all have a major cathedral, and cathedral schools also began to gather teachers. So there's a monastic school and a cathedral school, and they have some different philosophies as to how that education happens. But the cathedrals become the center of education as well, which means that the largest cities are, because only the largest cities have a cathedral, the largest cities become places where students are able to come and to flock and to learn and to grow. Remember, monasteries are usually out there in the country. They're way out, away from the world, and the cathedrals are in the city, the center of the world. So from these cathedral schools come the gathering of teachers and schools, and there's a name given for that gathering of students and teachers, and it's Universitas Magisterium et Scholarium, the community of teachers and scholars. So European higher education, it takes place for hundreds of years within the cathedral schools, and monks and nuns are teaching these classes. The cathedrals are paying for somebody who is well known to come along. We've mentioned Peter Abelard last time, and we were all a little shocked by Peter Abelard, but he was in Paris at the cathedral school. And in Europe, these young men started to come and to have an education based around what is called the trivium. And for those parents that homeschool in the room, the trivium is probably something that's well known to you. And Elizabeth, as a homeschool child, is having difficulty even hearing that on the Lord's Day. But it's preparation in the art of grammar and rhetoric and logic or dialect. And then there is the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So a trivium and a quadrivium as those things being taught. So at the set of the 12th century, newly rediscovered texts begin to make an impact, and intellectual expertise remains highly fragmented between monastic and cathedral schools. Different areas of expertise could be studied at the hands of different scholars, but they held posts in different schools. That meant that bright students' natural progression was peripatetic, meaning they have to go on their feet. So they're walking. They're moving between different schools to acquire different skills. So you want to learn logic, you go to this city and you learn at this cathedral school. And if you want to learn geometry, you go to this cathedral school and you learn from this professor. And if you want to learn music, you go to this particular school and you learn music. But in that time, the university comes into being as something that is a distinctly Christian institution. So the first, this is the University of Bologna, and that is in Italy. That's founded in 1088. And then the second of the Christian institutions is Oxford, and that is founded in 1096. And we're going to focus on Oxford for one specific reason. That's because we're English speakers. Like, Bologna in Italy, I don't know Italian, so I can't look at a lot of their information, but I can with Oxford. And then the third, that is the third most important of the old institutions, is the University of Paris. So Bologna first, Oxford second, Paris third within that order. So Bologna was known for law. You would, if you wanted to study law, you would go to Bologna and you'd study law based on the old Roman Empire and Christian laws that developed. If you went to Paris, you would study philosophy and the liberal arts, and then Oxford became that rival for Paris as a university as well. So Oxford and Paris as rival universities, and I'll get into why that is in a moment. So the beginning of scholarship happens in Oxford in the year 1096, and scholars began to come and to teach and to gather students around themselves, and they came together as a guild. So again, if you can think back on our discussion on literacy and passion plays, we talked about the guilds and how guilds were in charge of different parts of the passion plays in medieval Europe. The teachers or the education guild gathered as scholars came together and sort of unionized in that time. And this is not a well-documented period, 1096, but we know it's a starting point. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a moment. Now, the founding of Oxford, some give 1096 and some give 1115. And what we see in 1115 is the University of Oxford apparently comes into existence with 60 to 100 students assembled around Augustinian canons. So there's homes where Augustinian monks are living, and there's students that are coming to Oxford, and they're learning from those Augustinians. Now Oxford is interesting on an English map because it's one of those low points within the river where you could cross from one part of England to the next. So there's two main crossing points in the medieval period. One is London and one is Oxford. And because the water is lower at Oxford, you're able to travel in and out in a different way. So Oxford becomes that place where the oxen are brought across the river, and eventually the Augustinians come there and they set up because it becomes a trade route within England, and then students come to learn from the Augustinians that are there. Now, these religious houses in Oxford are well documented, and these Augustinian canons are active in the area. There's essentially 3 houses that are established under Augustinians, and they are teaching students that arrive. Now, that same year, 1150, the University of Paris is founded. So there's students that are in Oxford, and they hear that they can cross the English Channel into Brittany, and they can attend the University of Paris. So there's some back and forth between Oxford and Paris for education. Now again, we're building in our medieval history. We've talked about the Norman invasion. So France and England at this time are very, very connected. They're connected because those that were in the part of France called Brittany come into England and make it Britain. So there's a back and forth that occurs between the French and the English. So Oxford and Paris become something where students are easily exchanged. And in 1163, there is what's called the Studium Generale. So the Studium Generale is a place where all students are accepted to come and to learn. So this is a charter that is given, a Studium Generale. And the charter says that at a place that has the charter of a Studium Generale, they are able to receive students from all places. They are able to teach the arts and to have something of the higher faculties taught there as well. So the higher faculties are theology, law, and medicine. Those would be, if you were going to get a master's degree in this time, you had three choices: theology, law, or medicine. You couldn't take basket weaving, you couldn't take women's studies, none of these things. It's law, it's medicine, and it is theology. And this is where they're given their charters, and the charters come from the papacy. And during this time, this is what could be studied at Oxford. So that's about a 100-year run through in history, and then something happens in the year 1167. Oh, this map shows this is by the year 1500. These are all the major universities throughout Europe. So you see Oxford is underlined in red. Paris is underlined in red. Bologna, so the older ones are underlined in red, and then the later ones come in yellow, if you can see that on our screen. Now, the year 1167, the Becket controversy happens. Now, this is something that's important in our understanding of Christian education and medieval history. Last week, I mentioned Canterbury Tales. Remember Canterbury Tales, which is written about 250 years after this time. They are on a journey to visit the remains of Thomas Becket. So what happens in this Thomas Becket controversy? This is really very interesting. There is a conflict that occurs between Thomas Becket, who is at this time the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the King of England, who is King Henry II. Now, Becket is described as intelligent, charming, and authoritative. So that in many ways is a mixture that doesn't serve well in the history of the Christian church. Charming and intelligent are good. Authoritative and charming do not go well together. So in 1155, as Henry II understands and sees in Thomas Becket that he is a man of great skill, he appoints him as the Chancellor of England. So the Chancellor of England is essentially the private secretary to the king himself. So he's going to write letters, he's going to seal things, he's going to sign documents, he's going to be the top advisor to the King of England. So he and the king become close friends. They go hunting together, they game together, they travel together, and Becket embraces this life of the royal court, and his contemporaries said he enjoyed the vast wealth, he threw lavish parties, and he decorated his residence with beautiful furnishing and made numerous journeys to France on English ships. Now what happens is that because King Henry II sees so much value in Thomas Becket that he appoints him not only as chancellor, as top advisor, he says, you should also be the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the church and the state are going to be essentially controlled by one person. And Henry II says, if I can get Becket in this position, I can have a say over what happens in the church. So this is the age-old controversy as to that relationship between the crown and the cross. So on June 3rd of 1162, he is consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that, and at some point for the rest of the year, and against the king's wishes, he resigns as chancellor. So the king's idea as to how valuable this is going to be for England falls apart because Becket says, I will be one or I will be the other, but I will not be both. And what he does is we see that this series of disputes ensues regarding his division of power between the crown and the church. And by 1164, so 2 years, tensions are at an all-time high. And in October, Becket is summoned to appear before the king's council in order to forfeit all his personal property. And he refused to accept the terms of his punishment, and fearing further repercussions from the king, he flees to France. Now, where does Becket go? He goes to the University of Paris. So as he's in exile in France, he is rubbing shoulders with many of the most important people at the University of Paris, and he is gaining a reputation. Remember, he's brilliant, and he's charming, and he's authoritative, and he's gaining this reputation as somebody who would be of great value even to the University of Paris. So how does King Henry II respond? Well, of course, he puts his Make England Great Again hat on, and he comes against the University of Paris with saying that students from England are no longer able to study in Paris. Okay? So Paris is shut down to the English speakers. Now, decisions or political decisions or reactions have repercussions that are unknown at the time, and that's always true, okay? What happens is Oxford begins to swell. Students that at one time were going to Paris are saying, well, we can't cross the channel anymore, so we'll go to Oxford and we're going to study there. And Oxford begins to grow as a university, and Paris begins to decline with English students. Now in 1170, Becket comes back to England. It's December of 1170. And on December 29th, there are 4 knights that come to Canterbury Cathedral. And Becket is in his palace. And the 4 knights attempt to arrest him. And he refuses. And swords are drawn. And in that cathedral, you hear shouting, and the shouting is, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the kingdom?" And the knights rush him, and they manhandle him, and they drag him outside of the church, and their desire is to carry him away in chains. And because it's a cathedral, there's beautiful pillars, so this would be our beautiful pillar. He wraps around the beautiful pillar, and he refuses to be taken by those knights that are trying to take him. So what they do, instead of capturing him, is they slaughter him. Becket's crown as archbishop was by a sword separated from his head. And his death became this great pilgrimage site for those in Canterbury, because Thomas Becket was not seen as a bad guy to the church. He was in a personal dispute with the king that went too far, and Canterbury becomes this place where people go so they can pray at the place where Becket was killed. Now this has more travelers than coming from Europe, which then are in association with Oxford, and Oxford continues to grow even through this controversy. So Paris declined, Becket causing fame to come to England, students and others coming to England for this purpose. Now I'm going to give you 2 other Oxford stories that are important. And the first story comes from 1209. It's called the Oxford Riot. And what happens is, in 1209, there is a group of Oxford students and a local townswoman who is an innkeeper or a tavern keeper, and they get in a conflict at the tavern. Okay, so some will say, College life never changes, right? So there's a fight that breaks out in a bar in Oxford in 1209. And in the course of this altercation, the tavern owner, this woman, is killed by one of the students. So stories are different. There's a guy that literally wrote his PhD on this. Two main stories. The one that he likes the best is that there's a wooden goblet that would hold the mead, and it's thrown and it hits her in the head and it kills her. And as that death occurs and this bar fight breaks out, this conflict begins that is a conflict that gets a name that happens in all university towns throughout the rest of our history. So it's a conflict that's called town versus gown. So the gown representing scholarship and the town being the place where the city is. So in universities, starting here in Oxford, there are often these conflicts between the will of the town or the community and the will of the school. And that town or gown conflict starts in 1209. And the mayor of Oxford blamed the school, and without trial, he takes two young men in question and hangs them. So he hangs them as a way to bring justice to the tavern keeper's death. So as a result, those at Oxford say, this town is not safe for us. The gown is not protected here. So several of the students and several of the teachers pull out of Oxford, it's 1209, and they go to a town called Cambridge, and they establish another university. So Cambridge is established in 1209 because of this riot that occurs, or this town versus gown bar fight that breaks out. And Oxford and Cambridge, from 1209 on, they're going to develop differently in the sense that Oxford is going to be more higher church. It's going to be more sacramentally focused. And Oxford, even historically, even today, is going to be more obedient to the crown than Cambridge, that's founded because of a bar fight. And Cambridge is going to be a school that is centered on preaching, and that Augustinian intellect is going to be central in Cambridge. Now, something you all can figure out, our history as coming from Scotland and England as Presbyterians, Westminster Assembly happens in London. Almost all of the education of those men, who were called English Puritans, happens at Cambridge. So Augustinian, preaching-focused, word-focused, not committed to the king. Students and teachers at this time, going back to 1209, in the town they rent rooms and they buy food from the local sellers of food. And that town versus gown issue, that becomes more of an issue too, because a lot of the students that are coming into Oxford are students with means. So what's the rent? We'll pay it, or dad will pay it. What is the cost of the food you provide? What does meat cost? We'll pay it because dad will pay it. And those in the town are competing for places to rent, and they're competing for food to eat. They're competing for space in the taverns. And Oxford gets the idea that they're going to divide into what they call colleges, and those colleges will each provide a chapel, and they'll provide housing for students, and a center place where students can eat food provided by the schools. So dorms start because of this 1209 conflict, and these colleges have a man who's in charge of each one, who is called the dean. And all of this is to bring more control of the students, as well as to reduce the tensions between the town and the gown. Other riots occur at the history of Oxford: 1252, 1267, 1273, 1333, 1334, all major riots that occur. But the last one that I'll talk to you about is the St. Scholastica riot. So the St. Scholastica riot is also a riot that takes place in a tavern, or begins in a tavern. So the Swindlestock Tavern, if you go to Oxford today and you do a tour, you can go to the crossroads where the Swindlestock Tavern was, and there's a marker, a historical marker, that will say Swindlestock Tavern from this date to this date. It closed in like the late 1700s, and will tell you some of the St. Scholastica Day riot. So on the feast day of St. Scholastica, two students from Oxford are in the tavern, and they're complaining about the quality of wine being provided to the students. So their thought is that the townspeople get the better wine than the students who are coming into the tavern. And they quarrel with the tavern owner. And then as that quarrel blows up, we see that the inn's customers join in that quarrel. And eventually that disagreement turns into a riot. And the violence that started in the bar continues into the streets. And the conflict, violent conflict, lasts for 3 days after St. Scholastica's day. And the university was raided by the town, and students were murdered by the townspeople. And there were reports of those who were the clerics, or those that were the pastors and the priests and the monks that were on campus, that several of them were scalped. Now remember, these men were what was called tonsured. So you imagine, if my baldness continues and I still have it in the front, I'll be well tonsured. But it's just that funny ring of hair that the monks wore, shaved on the top, shaved on the sides and the bottom, and just that ring. So that tonsure was cut off by those in the midst of the riot. And at the end of 3 days, 30 people from the town were killed, and 63 members of the university, whether students or professors, ended up being killed. Now what happened is that as a decision was made, the papacy gets involved, and the mayor of the town ends up having to pay an annual fine and has to attend a mass on St. Scholastica's Day in penance for this problem. The mayor of Oxford, every year until the late 1800s, paid the fine and also attended the St. Scholastica Day Mass. So education rises. I guess I'm behind in my slides. Education rises, and we see that universities will continue. Scholasticism continues across the 12th and 13th centuries. Paris as the chief, but no means the only center of scholastic theology. There sprang up institutions where there's universities in North Europe, Association of Guild of Teachers. It made theology its major subject. The other outstanding early university, Bologna, which we talked about, was especially famous for law, and universities began to multiply in the 13th and 14th century. So we think about what we've talked about in like the 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, and that's what's traditionally called the Dark Ages, right? Those are those ages where they're saying there's not a lot going on in that time. But in the 12th century, from medieval darkness, that darkness begins to go away as universities begin to spring up, not only in Italy and France and England, but also in Germany and other parts of the world. And the center of these universities have men who are teaching that are men that are well known throughout the world, both in the church and outside of the church. So Anselm, Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and these men are the ones that are called the schoolmen or the scholastics. And they mix in their teaching both philosophy, ancient philosophy, as well as theology. And they're trying to merge these two disciplines together in this time. So as this education is rising, there's students that are enrolling and paying tuition, and they sit for lectures, and the professors are salaried, and they're members of specific faculty, medicine, law, theology, the arts, etc. And the universities across Europe are chartered. Now we think of the curriculum of that as well. These are all pictures from Oxford University, places you can visit. And I mentioned Harry Potter already, but Harry Potter's filmed at Oxford. So if you like the school, what's it called? Hogwarts. Hogwarts is Oxford University, if you've seen the films. So students start at the age of 14. They stay at the university for a minimum of 8 years. The seven liberal arts are taught. We talked about trivium, that's grammar, dialect, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium, math, science, which is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, all being taught. And there's pupils, both the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy are there because they are nobles and they can afford to go. And most of the poor are there because there's scholarships provided by other wealthy families that want the poor to be able to go and to be a part of that system. And we know that from those universities, major professions that require literacy and learning, they begin to flourish again throughout Europe. So again, law, medicine, theology, bishops are wanting those that have studied at the universities to hire from them, and those that that want educated persons are looking to Oxford, and they're pulling from there. They're saying, these are the men that we want. Now remember, at this time, priests are not required to read. Priests only have to memorize the Mass. And when they memorize the Mass, they can say the Mass. But if you were going to be a bishop, you had to be able to read. And bishops have a lot of administrative requirements as well. And in those administrative requirements, they appreciated men that came from Oxford. All right, so what's the point, right? What's the big takeaway? You've been asking the question, at least in your head. And I want you to think about the importance of the university system toward the reformation of the church. So there's 6 things that influence the 16th century's Protestant Reformation. And the university is that nucleus that expands, that allows for the Reformation to happen. And at the same time, it's important to understand that the university is directly connected to Christian education. So there's some in this room who would say, for college or for university, you ought to send your kids to a Christian school. And they'll give their reasons why. We'll pull out our little copy of J.G. Voss's Foundation, he's the original writer, Foundations for Christian Education. We'll say, here's the reasons why your kids should be educated at a Christian college. So I said some of you will disagree with that. It's okay. But the importance of the university system as a direct Christian institution and towards Reformation is, one, it preserves the study of Scripture and the study of theology. So universities study what it was called the Sacra Pagina, or the sacred page. The Scriptures were the center of what was taught at those universities. So if you're going to study law, not only are you studying Roman law, but you're saying, what's the Bible say about law? And you're opening up the books of Moses, and you're looking at the law. And the same is true for medicine and philosophy and music and geometry. All of this interpreted through the Scriptures, through what the Scriptures tell us about these things. So this tradition lays the foundation for the later reformers, Luther and Calvin, who are both schoolmen, that both come through the university system, to think beyond what they're taught and to look to the Scriptures, because the Scriptures are what's central as they're taught. Second, the scholastic method and logic. So disputation, or being able to argue properly, logic and dialect are things that are essential to those that are studying at the universities. Okay? So if you go and you start a debate with somebody from the university at this time, they're going to give you a logical argument, and they're going to debate properly, and they're going to say, here's my reasons for, and they're going to give what they believe, and they're going to say, here's what the Scriptures say, here's what other authorities say, here's what Plato said about this, here's what the ancient church said about this, and they're going to form an argument. And that argument will be defended and discussed. Now, we think of university students today, and we're not really thinking about logical argumentation, because debate from logic versus debate from emotion or emotive debate are very, very different things. But scholastic method and logic become extremely important. In 1518, Luther has what was called the Heidelberg Disputation, and it follows the scholastic method of debate in its structure. It's learned that way. Calvin's Institutes is written in this way. Here's a premise, and I'm going to defend that premise. And I'm going to go to the Scriptures, and I'm going to go to philosophy, and I'm going to go to the Fathers. I'm going to go to logic, and I'm going to work through that premise, and then we'll move on to another premise. Critical questioning. Peter Lombard, who we'll learn about later, has the sentences, and we'll talk about the sentences later. Humanism comes from the university. There's humanism and secular humanism. Humanism is the late medieval humanism. But the roots of that begin to develop here at the university, and the cry of humanism was ad fontes, or at the fountain, or at the source. So not only do we want to hear secondary sources, like if you're studying medieval theology and you're like, Pastor Nathan's nerdy class is so interesting that I'm going to dedicate my life and I'm going to get a PhD in medieval theology. This is not the information that you're going to go to. You're going to go to the medievals and you're going to learn Latin, and you're going to read what they say rather than what I say they say. So ad fontes coming from the university. The forerunners of the Reformation come as well. John Wycliffe comes from Oxford, and we're going to talk about Wycliffe later on. Jan Hus comes from the University of Prague. These are professors that are challenging ecclesiastical abuses because they're looking at the Scriptures. So Reformation comes even through these places. Something that is literally in the news right now is academic freedom. We have a crown versus the cross debate going on in our society as our president is debating Harvard University as to how much academic freedom they have. Historically, academic freedom, because of the charters of university, said the town cannot discipline the gown for what they teach. We keep those separate. So academic freedom allowed for discussions and decisions to happen. Does anyone recognize the photo? Stephen, what's the photo?
The monument to Martin Luther's 95 Theses.
Right, so this is the church door in Wittenberg's. These are the doors. They've been replaced with these steel doors that have the 95 Theses on them. Luther's Reformation, or the beginning of Luther's Reformation, began with a discussion at a university that Luther was allowed to have because of academic freedom. 95 theses posted. Let's talk about these things. Let's debate these things and see if these are true. And then lastly, a transmission of knowledge and literacy. Medieval universities taught Latin, and allowing that centerpiece of Latin to be what all the universities taught, in a sense, it brings down Babel. Meaning that if you didn't know French and your friend in Paris didn't know English, the scholars between Oxford and Paris aren't really able to communicate. But all the work is done in Latin. So it begins to gather together this joint intellectual understanding, so that the medieval church is able to flourish under these ideas. So all of this connected to Christian education and the importance of Christian education. And for us, for English speakers, Anglos living in this society, Presbyterians coming from that tradition, Oxford is our mother school in that history. And that's where we'll end. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, thanks. Oh, Paul. You defend the Vikings? Is that what we're doing?
No, nothing about the Vikings, but about academic freedom leading us today.
Well, it's a mess. But so their understanding of academic freedom, remember, it's like with children. When children are given freedom without boundaries, they're uncomfortable. But when kids are given freedom with boundaries, they flourish. Okay? For education, the boundary markers was what the church taught, was the Christian faith, what the Bible says. And they had all this freedom to debate within that discussion. And today there's no boundaries, right? You can debate whatever you want without a starting point or a presupposition. Now, everyone has a presupposition. It's just for us in Christian universities in our history, that presupposition is the believability of the scriptures. So that's academic freedom has boundaries, just like all academic freedom. We know, like at Harvard, academic freedom can be pro-Palestinian but not pro-Israel, right? So they have their boundaries. Everyone does. All right, we got to go.